Hi, everyone, and welcome to 10-Minute Elections. It is Thanksgiving 2020, so I hope everyone is having a fantastic day filled with lots of good food. Pretty big announcement here. 10-Minute Elections is on Instagram. My handle is 10-Minute Elections, all one word, all lowercase. So, any and all support in that regard would be highly appreciated as I continue to grow the channel. This is a Senate recap video. I originally recorded a take something like a week ago, but that I was out of town for a few days at the beginning of my Thanksgiving break, and so I just wanted to record new footage instead of edit that, especially with the last few votes trickling in from rural parts of Alaska, John James conceding in Michigan, just things like that that made me want to re-record this instead of using that footage. So we'll just jump right into it. In Alaska, Dan Sullivan won roughly 53% of the vote here to Al Gross's 41, which put it in the likely column. Although there are a couple of points of interest here. First of all, Al Gross ran roughly 5 points ahead of Joe Biden, and that's part of, I think, Al Gross being the independent candidate. Democrats typically do not do well in Alaska, and if they're Democrats, they're very independent candidates. Most Democrats that win in Alaska just run as independents, much like Al Gross. So the Alaskan political spectrum doesn't exactly line up with the rest of the unions in that libertarians and Democrats, and oftentimes independents too, all run in one joint primary. Obviously, libertarians and Democrats seem like two extremely different parties, but in Alaskan politics, they're actually much more similar versions of those parties than in the rest of the country. So Al Gross did come out of that primary, had the endorsement of the Alaska Democratic Party, and run a respectable 41% of the vote in the state. Another vote that happened in Alaska on election day was regarding the introduction of ranked choice voting. The state of Maine already has it. They implemented it for the 2020 election. But ranked choice voting, essentially, if you have one winner, then what's going to happen is all the voters go vote on election day, but instead of just voting for one candidate, they rank their choices, and they can rank as few or as many as they like, but they can't skip numbers. So you can write just a one or a one and a two or a one, two, three, four, five. You can go as much as you like. So the if one candidate has 50% of the vote plus one, that candidate wins. The election's over. Otherwise, you're going to start eliminating candidates. So you're going to eliminate the candidate with the lowest number of first choice votes. Then you're going to reallocate all those votes to those voters' next choices. Check if someone now has a majority, 50% plus one vote. If not, you're just going to repeat that process until someone has a majority. Someone is eventually guaranteed to have a majority because eventually you will just get down to two candidates. So someone's either going to get a majority or you're going to have a tied election in which different states have different protocols regarding tied elections, but they're extraordinarily rare given the very high volume of ballots being cast. So the ranked choice voting amendment was approved by 1%, 50.5% in favor, 49.5% opposed. And what ranked choice voting really does is twofold. It eliminates the spoiler effect, meaning that third parties can't really spoil the election by eating into a sizable chunk of another candidate's vote share, because if that candidate gets eliminated, those votes are just going to bounce right back onto that candidate, assuming that those were those voters' second choice votes. Also, it eliminates throwaway votes. A lot of times you see the main criticism for third party, fourth party, etc. candidates is that, oh, if you vote for them, you're just throwing away your vote because they're not going to win. That's not a problem in ranked choice voting because those votes really aren't being thrown away. They're just being transferred to another candidate. So you can vote for your favorite. If your favorite candidate is a lesser known one that's probably not going to win the election, you can vote for that candidate as your first choice and then a major party candidate as a second or your third or anywhere down the line because eventually your ballot will probably get there. But Alaska went by a 53-41 margin for Dan Sullivan. Originally, it was looking like it would be safe, but those last few mail-in ballots, Alaska has a pretty generous deadline for accepting them, made it a likely margin. And in Oregon, Jeff Merkley defeated Joe Ray Perkins handily. In Iowa, Jim Risch will enjoy another term. And in Montana, Steve Bullock, I was projecting Steve Bullock to run pretty far ahead of Joe Biden, maybe by 10 points, and that's why I only had it as a tilt Republican. Steve Bullock, despite being an extraordinarily popular governor, really statewide, didn't do that as Steve Daines, just by being a Republican in Montana and largely sticking with the president, couldn't do too much wrong, so he won. Now, granted, Steve Bullock did run a little bit ahead of Joe Biden, but it wasn't enough, as Steve Daines still won 55% of the vote compared to Steve Bullock's 45%. Cynthia Lummis easily won another term in Wyoming, Mike Rounds in South Dakota, and Ben Sasse in Nebraska, as well as Jim Inhofe in Oklahoma, all defeated their respective Democratic opponents. Now, in Arizona, Mark Kelly ran this one a little bit closer than expected, but he still won by a lean margin. He won 51.2% of the vote compared to McSally's 48.8. So this is roughly what I was projecting, approximately a 3-point margin for Mark Kelly, but it wasn't necessarily what some polls were forecasting. So TME did get this one correct, as Mark Kelly was able to drive up Maricopa County turnout among voters of color, younger voters, sufficiently enough, and win a decent portion of the suburbs and Hispanic voters, which proved a major thorn in the side of Democratic candidates across the country otherwise. Martha McSally did decently well, but just not enough for, especially in Maricopa County, which Democrats did win narrowly across the board. Now, I talked about this in the presidential video, though. The Democrats did not win the Arizona State House. That stayed in Republican hands. So this really was not necessarily Arizona's election to go blue, and this is why I'm certainly keeping it on battleground watch for the next couple of election cycles. This was not the election where Arizona went blue as it was widely forecasted. This was an election where Arizona rebuked Trumpian conservatism and elected Joe Biden and Mark Kelly narrowly, but the state still sort of went Republican on a more local level. So it'll be really interesting to see how those two contrasting vote totals play out and resolve each other in elections to come. I want to look at Arizona. There will be a lot of videos in Arizona in the 2022 midterms because Mark Kelly will have to run again. I don't know who the Republican will be at that time. And then in 2024, it'll be a de-leaning but interesting state to watch on the presidential level. New Mexico, Ben Ray Lujan was expected to win easily here. He only actually won this race by, let me color. I'm sorry, my computer's lagging a little bit. There goes Arizona. Okay, Ben Ray Lujan, I was projecting to win this one by 14, 15 points. He only won by 6. And Yvette Harrell, the Republican candidate for basically the entirety of southern New Mexico, actually defeated in an upset House victory Xochitl Torres Small. So Ben Ray Lujan only won 51% of the vote, which shows that New Mexico might actually be somewhat competitive in future elections. This was a state that Joe Biden won fairly handily, but Ben Ray Lujan actually ran significantly behind that. Nevertheless, he will be headed to the Senate as the Republican never really stood a great chance, although they did overperform on election day here. John Hickenlooper, the quite popular former governor of Colorado, easily defeated Cory Gardner here, as Gardner was never really able to distance himself from the president in a quite blue state that voted against Donald Trump and Cory Gardner, for that matter, by double digits. Cory Gardner just not popular enough to overcome the supposed incumbency advantage, which is obviously bigger with some candidates than others. But nevertheless, John Hickenlooper and Joe Biden running roughly even in Colorado, and John Hickenlooper will be Colorado's next senator. Roger Marshall, really as expected, defeated Barbara Bollier by a likely margin. In Kansas, this race was never too competitive since Chris Kobach wasn't running, but it did go by roughly the margin I projected. And in Texas, John Cornyn did win his reelection by roughly 7 points, running a little bit ahead of Donald Trump, which was expected. I did expect John Cornyn to run ahead of Trump by 1 point just because of Trump's relative unpopularity for a Republican in the state. And John Cornyn's not necessarily popularity, but lack of extreme unpopularity. That was really what made Ted Cruz so divisive and what got the vote out for Beto O'Rourke against him. And that just wasn't exactly the case with MJ Hagar. MJ Hagar was a fairly good candidate, but obviously no Beto O'Rourke, despite decent fundraising totals. So, let's move on from Texas here. Going into Louisiana, the Democratic vote was split between two candidates, but no matter. Bill Cassidy won a comfortable majority, 59% of the vote to be exact. Tom Cotton won two-thirds of the vote against challenger Ricky Harrington, who was not a Democrat because the Democrats didn't even field a candidate here. Mississippi was actually closer than Alabama. Doug Jones couldn't even win 40% of the vote here. Tommy Tuberville was able to win 60. And I think Doug Jones at this point can just hope for a cabinet spot. Doug Jones, I would say, did not do enough to distance himself from Chuck Schumer to win in Ruby Red, Alabama. But I also think that anything but a solid Republican doesn't win here, considering that Alabama is still a state where Trump is very popular. And really, just tying yourself to Trump and not being Roy Moore should be good enough. Keep in mind, Doug Jones barely won against Roy Moore, who had a whole plethora of issues. So now that you've got Tommy Tuberville, who obviously Alabama is a huge football state, even politics aside, Doug Jones was already in a massive hole. And now the fact that he's really not voting against his party, even as consistently as Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Uh, Doug Jones, I wouldn't say he was lucky to get the vote he got because, frankly, he should have gotten more of the vote. But I never thought that Doug Jones would pull it out in Alabama. Now, Mike Espy actually made it a surprisingly close race in Mississippi. Mike Espy challenged Cindy Hyde-Smith in the last Mississippi Senate election and lost. They were headed for a rematch, and I had it projected as a likely say. It only went to Hyde-Smith by 10 points. Hyde-Smith is not all that popular of a senator, and Mike Espy was fairly popular, Obama's Secretary of Agriculture. But it's very interesting to see that despite the Democrats supposedly having the incumbency advantage in Alabama, Mississippi actually went 10 points more Democratic than Alabama, and Mississippi could actually be in play certainly by 2028. By 2028 or 2032, I expect Mississippi to actually be a battleground state if the state of the two current political parties hold, which is quite frankly doubtful. Bill Hagerty defeated Marquita Bradshaw easily in Tennessee. Bill Hagerty's real challenge was always going to be the primary against Manny Sethi, and after he won that fairly easily, it was smooth sailing, and Mitch McConnell won by roughly 20 points in Kentucky. Shelley Moore Capito defeated Paula Jean Swearengin. Paula Jean Swearengin, the Democratic candidate, not even able to get 30% of the vote in the state of West Virginia. And in Illinois, despite Joe Biden's only likely win here, Dick Durbin did run about a point ahead of Joe Biden and win by a safe margin over Republican challenger Mark Curran. In Iowa, I was projecting Teresa Greenfield to actually very narrowly win this one by about a fifth of a point. That just didn't materialize on election day, as what was expected to be an incredibly close state turned out to essentially revert to its conservatism shown in 2016, as Republicans flipped a House seat, possibly two, but Ashley Hinson defeated Abby Finkenauer in the eastern half of Iowa, and the other race there, Rita Hart versus Marionette Miller Meeks. Last time I checked, the Republican candidate Miller Meeks was actually ahead, but only by roughly 50 votes, and we're still waiting for that race to be called, as it is incredibly close. But anyway, Joni Ernst was able to win here easily. Teresa Greenfield was, quite frankly, campaigning on the right issues and whatnot, but it just didn't make a difference, as the polling data that was showing Iowa to be much more competitive than 2016 was simply inaccurate, as the voting patterns really just reverted to how they were then. Minnesota, Tina Smith only beat Jason Lewis here. She won by a likely margin, but just barely. It was 5.3 points. She ran considerably behind Joe Biden by multiple points. Tina Smith is not an unpopular senator. Now, she's not all that popular. She was appointed by Democratic Governor Tim Walz to replace Democratic Senator Al Franken, and she essentially just went with the political climate in Minnesota, didn't really buck her party on any key votes, and was led to victory actually fairly similar to Ben Ray Lujan's in New Mexico in terms of margin. Michigan, John James just conceded this race, and props to John James with his extra and this is not political or anything, or at least that's not my intention, but with John James' extra $1 million+ of campaign donations, he actually donated to multiple children's hospitals, food banks, etc., etc. So good on John James for using those extra contributions for good. But anyway, he has finally conceded the race to Gary Peters, who ran roughly a point behind Joe Biden, but did win his Senate race, as I projected, by a lean margin. Now, the polling data did significantly overestimate him, but obviously, like, Joe Biden was never going to win the state of Michigan by 17, 18 points, and Gary Peters was never going to run much like that. But ultimately, Gary Peters never really, again, just like Tina Smith, in a light blue state, Gary Peters didn't really buck his party on any key votes, and John James was a strong candidate, but the voters of Michigan already rejected him by 11 points. They re-elected Debbie Stabenow over John James, Debbie Stabenow being the other Democratic senator from Michigan, and they did the same in this election. I do think John James has a political future, but given that he's from, again, Michigan is a light blue state, although it may not be that way in 2024, John James' path is probably going to be through the House more than the Senate. And it would take a Republican wave year to get him elected to the Senate. Now, the state of Virginia, this one was actually called for Mark Warner and Joe Biden when the two were behind in their respective races, but it was just because the outstanding vote from Fairfax County, and Fairfax County really being the only major vote outstanding, convinced most outlets that this race would end up comfortably in Democratic hands, and indeed it did. At the end of the day, Mark Warner was able to pull in 56% of the vote here compared to Mark Curran's 44%, giving them a 12-point margin and re-election to another 6 years in the Senate. And with Virginia's other senator, Hillary Clinton's running mate Tim Kaine, re-elected in 2018, we will not see a Senate election in Virginia until 2024 with the next presidential election. Now, North Carolina. Tom Tillis was the Republican and widely not expected to win, but ultimately North Carolina did go red on election day, as the vote share from the Research Triangle for the Democratic candidate simply wasn't enough to overcome the suburban swing to the Republicans, and a very strong Republican showing in the western part of the state. Madison Cawthorn being elected to the House by a likely margin over Mo Davis. So, Cal Cunningham ran roughly half a point behind Joe Biden, ended up losing this race by a margin of 48.7% to 46.9. So again, roughly half a point behind Joe Biden, who lost, I believe, by 1.4 points. So Cal Cunningham ultimately was really hurt by that scandal, that extramarital affair that came up in the months before the election, and the fact that moderate voters, again, and I keep bringing this up, in the presidential election, and I know this is senatorial, but in the presidential election, self described moderate voters went for Biden, yes, but only by 4 points. He needed more. He probably realistically needed to win those voters by double digits to win this state. Same with Cal Cunningham, and that just didn't happen for either. South Carolina, Jamie Harrison, despite having a lot of attention to that race, I was saying this was going to be a thorn in the side of Republicans, although they should edge it out. And indeed, despite the massive fundraising from Jamie Harrison, they did just that. Lindsey Graham did win his re-election by roughly 10 points. So Lindsey Graham did run behind Donald Trump, but this was to be expected. Given that Lindsey Graham's an unpopular senator, Jamie Harrison was a popular nominee. Ultimately, though, in South Carolina, if the Democrats aren't winning in North Carolina, they're certainly not winning in South Carolina. North Carolina is much more likely to flip. We saw a slew of Democratic incumbents win across the Northeast, including Jeanne Shaheen, who actually did win by a safe margin against Republican challenger Corky Messner. So Jeanne Shaheen won by roughly a 56 to 41 margin and will head back to the Senate. Susan Collins in Maine. This one was outside the margin of error of nearly every poll, given that Susan Collins literally has led in one poll since February, and it was by a point. So, in a state that Joe Biden won by 9 points, Sarah Gideon lost by 9 points, and Susan Collins only even lost the very liberal and urban 1st District of Maine, which went safely for Joe Biden. Susan Collins only lost it by 3 points and ran up huge margins, especially in the northern part of the state. Susan Collins actually won multiple cities that went for the vice president or the president elect on the presidential level, and she certainly won a lot. She won overwhelmingly the 2nd congressional district. So A lot of the Gideon's campaign's downfall was that with them, they were raising huge funds, but they weren't using them effectively. They were using them to barrage ads and more TV ads and flyers for that matter. They weren't really using them for local engagement per se. They were just using them for generalized messages. And a lot of this was probably the most negative Senate race on in the country from both sides, but especially from the Gideon side, really hammering Collins over being a supposedly McConnell and Trump puppet, and that really didn't fly with the voters of Maine come election day. Really, just because the only votes that she genuinely had to hammer Collins over were her Kavanaugh vote, her tax vote, and her impeachment vote to acquit. So obviously, those are still because Maine is a light blue state, and even bluer than Michigan. These attacks went far, but clearly not far enough for Gideon to beat a very unpopular Republican incumbent, but one that still won on election day. So Maine went in the likely Collins column and gave Republicans 50 seats to Democrats 48. Now, my Georgia predictions I will go over in a future video, but the special election is going to be a tilt R. The regular election is going to be lean. Ultimately, the Democrats are going to have a much more difficult time getting those voters back to the polls that turn the state blue for Joe Biden. And I know I'm rating these as Republican races despite the fact that it did go to Joe Biden on the presidential level. So, Georgia's obviously a prediction, but other than that, here is the final 2020 Senate race results. 50 seats for the Republicans, 48 for the Democrats. They need to win both Georgia seats in order to take control of the Senate. Otherwise, Mitch McConnell will remain the majority leader. Thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content and want to see more of it. Let me know down in the comments what videos you want to see next. I've got a whole list of videos that I want to do in the coming month, but I really want to hear from you guys as well. Also, of course, drop your takes in the comment section. Follow 10 Minute Elections Instagram if you would like, and I will see y'all next time.